We've had a really long and very collaborative relationship with the council going back, over a decade. We've enjoyed working with the council, all of its members, certainly under the leadership of Deborah Wynn-Smith. We have learned a lot, and we hope that we've been able to contribute a lot to the dialogue around competitiveness, and particularly around manufacturing competitiveness. A lot of this effort goes back to really the beginning of the financial downturn. And even before that had started, before it was in full swing, I think we had identified manufacturing as the next big thing. Maybe hard to remember, but presenting that as a notion of the next big thing, that being a world-class advanced manufacturing country would be important in 2008 when we first started dialoguing about doing this, was probably not a topic that looked like it was going to get a lot of traction. And in reality, it's become a focal point for a lot of policy, both in this country and around the world, as countries have tried to grow their economic base, their job base, and more importantly, their economic prosperity. So Deborah, thank you for that leadership and guiding us to the next big thing. And I think you've done a great job in helping us push this forward. Over the last decade, we've had a chance to do a number of things. On the left-hand side, you see a couple of previous versions. In 2010, we published the first Global Manufacturing Competitiveness Index. And we went out to do that, to talk to and to survey CEOs and senior executives around the world, specifically about which countries were most competitive from a manufacturing standpoint, as well as what the drivers of competitiveness were. I mean, what matters to make a country competitive? And the biggest reason we did that was when we looked at other indices that were being published, particularly from organizations like the World Economic Forum, they were telling us that Switzerland was the most competitive nation in the world. And yet, back in 2008 and 2009, there weren't too many manufacturing CEOs I talked to that felt like they were losing jobs or they were losing opportunities to Switzerland. That China was at the top of their list. So we said, apparently there's a different set of criteria. We need to go out and measure those things that are relevant to both manufacturing and advanced manufacturing and see where countries fall. We also had a chance to do a number of face-to-face interviews with CEOs, which was published in Ignite 1.0, university presidents and national laboratory leaders in Ignite 2.0, as well as labor leaders, which was actually fascinating, in Ignite 3.0. Tremendous amount of commonality, although most of the media is around the things that labor and business don't agree on. But the reality is there's a tremendous overlap in terms of what's right for the country in terms of competitiveness. And then we had a chance to do some other leading edge articles and how high-performing companies actually differentiate themselves relative to all others. Over the last year, Deborah has again extracted thousands of pro bono man hours out of Deloitte, and we appreciate the opportunity to do that in two parallel efforts. The first effort was something that's called the Advanced Technology Initiative that was focused on advanced manufacturing as well as energy. And the second was, and I really didn't think she was ever going to get me to do this again, that our team to do this again, but we updated the Global Manufacturing Competitiveness Index. So we're on kind of a 3-year cycle. Maybe we should wait 4 years this time and have a 2020 version or publish it early. But we're going to be releasing today. Even Deborah hasn't seen this because we didn't think the results were going to be ready. But we got part of the results ready, which is actually the ranking of countries according to CEOs around the world. That's really hot off the press for press release that's being basically been released today. And we're going to be intertwining the results of both of those studies in our conversation here over the next few minutes. As part of the Advanced Technology Initiative, we had a chance to talk to a number of chief technology officers, 30 in total across the country, getting their perspectives on where the nation stands from an innovation standpoint, what things that they were personally, their companies were working on, what their agendas were, and then finally, what their interactions have been with a portion of the national innovation ecosystem, and that was particularly the national labs and things that were related to the national labs. And those are fascinating one-on-one conversations that we had over the last year. We also had a chance to talk to many of the national laboratory leaders. Some of them are present here today. And this is really the first phase of an effort where the initial effort is focused on the laboratories. In the future, we hope to focus on other aspects of the innovation ecosystem, such as the university system, which is obviously a very important part of the ecosystem. But for this study, we focus specifically on that connection between the private sector and the labs. And obviously, the labs are a tremendous asset to the country, and there is overlap, and there are certainly joint projects between the private sector and the laboratory system. There's not a lot of those, and we can talk a little bit about that. But in general, it was a very positive, uplifting experience looking at the capability sets that these laboratories have and the tremendous depth of capabilities and insights that they have. We really tried to explore, a variety of things, the prospects for U.S. technology innovation within the domestic and global innovation environment, the top concerns about the prospects for U.S. technology leadership over both the short and long term, the most promising and attractive and impactful technologies and challenges associated with developing such technologies, the level of engagement between the private sector and the national laboratories, and recommendations for how we might improve that connection to get greater synergy. And then important areas the United States must address to remain technologically competitive in the long term. So I want to give you a brief set of highlights and try to stay on time. The report was being handed out at the front desk before you leave. If you haven't already got a chance, it looks like this. It's fairly voluminous. We're in a process. We actually have some copies of an executive summary, which is a short version of the same thing for those of you that want to do speed reading, and that should help bring this down. But I'm going to repeat themes that you've heard all morning. The interviews that we conducted, the research that we conducted, largely directed by the interviews, things that executives and laboratory leaders told us to look at and presented to us, is really reinforced what we've heard this morning. And overall, clearly manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, is a key component of driving competitiveness, but more importantly, national prosperity. And when we looked at the statistics that you've got, 40 million jobs associated either directly or indirectly with the advanced technology industries, and 70% of those being manufacturing. You've got over $2.7 trillion of GDP associated with this type of industry, this type of manufacturing. And it really does differentiate a country in terms of what it can provide its citizens, the opportunities it can provide, and the capability set to extend into a very robust job environment that then becomes self-reinforcing. So there's a lot of really great statistics, really interesting information in here I think you'll enjoy. We also spent a lot of time trying to understand, but more importantly, get onto one page a picture of the U.S. innovation ecosystem. So this was what we came up with. You've been talking about it here this morning. And the U.S. innovation ecosystem is probably one of the most robust in the world, and that was reinforced by these chief technology officers who have operations all around the world, as well as the national laboratory leaders. The combination of the venture capital funds, the Silicon Valley, the university system, the national laboratories, the interaction between the private sector and the public sector, all reinforce a system that is amazingly robust and produces outstanding results. Despite that, though, there are some things that would cause us to have some concerns as we think about the future and as we looked at some of the data. Businesses are driving a significant portion of the R&D spending, and the U.S. government spending on R&D has declined as a percentage of the total federal budget in the past decade. And many of the experts we spoke to, as well as other research that we did, would suggest that this is putting basic and applied research performed by government-sponsored labs at risk, as those budgets either get stabilized, they don't get increased, or in many cases they get decreased. Businesses are accounting for more and more of the financing, the funding for research and development in this country, and they're also carrying out most of the commercialization work. And then if we look at the trends around who's actually doing the spending, that black line and those black bubbles, I know this is very hard to see, is the U.S., and while it has gone up over the last decade, it's relatively modest. Down at the bottom, that red line and that red bubble is China, and many experts project that China will, in fact, be outspending the U.S. in terms of research and development by 2019. So before the end of this decade, China is going to continue this very rapid progression. The other countries there are Japan, South Korea, and Germany. And you can see there's progress in all of those areas, but nowhere near as much as we see in terms of growth as we see in South Korea and particularly China. The good news is that currently U.S. companies dominate the landscape from a research and development standpoint. 41 of the top 100 global R&D companies are from the U.S. This is one of those diagrams where we have it all in a giant block. So that block of black up there, those are the U.S. companies that represent the top 100. And you can see that the U.S. is in a really strong position, not only from a national or federal fund standpoint, even if other countries are catching up, but particularly from the private sector. So this all bodes well for the future. But the concerns when we talk to both the CTOs and particularly the national laboratories is that the difference, the margin that the U.S. has in terms of leadership over other countries, including China, or specifically China, has been narrowing significantly. And the question is, can we keep ahead as we go forward further into the 21st century? A lot of the conversation with the private sector was, what are you investing in? What technologies matter the most to you? And what we found, and we supplemented that with fresh data from the Global Manufacturing Competitiveness Index, is that there's a really significant emphasis being placed on digital technology, including the use of advanced sensors, the Internet of Things, as well as predictive analytics. I don't know if Keith Noshbush is still here, but I know that would be very important to him, as he may have actually caught a plane going out, because I showed him some of the results and I told him what part of the world that he actually needed to focus on, and I'll show you in a second. So we also found, though, that different countries have very different strategies. The U.S. and China spread the R&D dollars in a more holistic fashion across industries and across topics, whereas other countries such as Germany, Japan, South Korea have a much more focused approach, effectively an industrial policy, where they're planning to be good and are good in certain areas, and they're investing explicitly in those areas, and much, in disregarding other areas as compared to the way China and the U.S. are doing it. So again, this is really some of the first data out of this Global Manufacturing Competitiveness Index, based on the input from over 550 CEOs or their designees around the world. This was the list of top technologies that they believe are most important going forward for their competitiveness. And we've broken the results between region or country, in this case the US, China, and Europe, for this presentation. If you look closely, you'll see that 4 of the top 5 are the same for the US, China, and Europe. They may be in a different order, but predictive analytics, smart connected products, the Internet of Things, advanced materials, as a nod to Jim Phillips, and nanotechnologies for one of those things, advanced metals and steel. Another example, smart factories. This is where Keith Noshbush caught that airplane, and he's headed out to various parts of the world, like Europe, where they're very interested in those smart factories right now, as well as digital design, simulation, integration. Those 4 of those same 5 are in the top for both for China, the U.S., and for Europe. The difference really is China's emphasis, interestingly enough, on high-performance computing. China's placing a much more significant emphasis than either the U.S. or Europe is on high-performance computing. Since that wasn't a result that we had actually anticipated, I can't tell you honestly that we actually asked questions about that, because we didn't know we were going to find that in terms of what's actually driving that. I know Deborah has spent some quality time in China, can probably verify that through her anecdotal experiences and the conversations she's had there, but there is tremendous emphasis on that. But in general, you're seeing the list of technologies where the private sector says that they're going to invest, they're going to get good at, and they're going to compete going forward. So I've kind of unveiled part of the Global Competitiveness Index. So this is where, if I had a drum roll, if I had music, if you were engaged, you would sing or somehow cheer. We're going to roll out the results for the 2016 Manufacturing Competitiveness Index. And I think there really are some really interesting findings here. I know this is a little bit of an eye test. On the left-hand side is the current competitiveness index, and that shows what executives around the world believe are the most competitive nations. We've calculated, or we've computed it into a 100-point index, and we've ranked them. CEOs around the world continue to tell us that China is the most competitive manufacturing nation in the world. They told us that in 2013. They told us that again for this 2016 index. Interestingly, though, the U.S. has jumped up to number 2. They were number 3 in 2013. And if you look at the index score, you almost can't differentiate between China's score and the U.S. score. And that kind of gives you an indication of where it goes in the future. One of the unique things about this index and this survey and discussion with CEOs is that we ask them to project forward 5 years. Their projections forward are probably not a lot better than other projections, but it's a future-looking index based on their experiences in the marketplace. And if you look forward, they say in 5 years, the U.S. will be the most competitive manufacturing nation. That has shown steady progress for the U.S. I'll give Deborah credit, her advanced manufacturing initiative that we've been working with her on over the last decade, but the emphasis on advanced manufacturing, on manufacturing in general, seems to be taking hold, and CEOs around the world are taking note of that. And not only is the U.S. projected to go to number 1, but you see that the gap between the U.S. and China starts to grow pretty significantly, at least if you believe the index scores, right? So where there's a 0.5 point difference today, there becomes a 6.5 point difference 5 years from now. The other thing that you've noticed, that if you've been studying this like we have for a long period of time, is that India has dropped considerably. India has always been the next biggest thing coming, according to manufacturing executives, in the 2010, the 2013 index. I think they've now said, well, it's really not here, although they're still optimistic for where India will be in 5 years, where they hope they'll go from 11th to 5th. It's unclear whether they'll make that jump because they're projecting them higher in the past, and now they've moderated their perspectives around that. A few other things I'll try to point out, maybe a little bit differently. Brazil is actually probably the country that's taken the biggest fall in this index over the period of time that we've been doing it. It's dropped to 29th. In the future, there is some optimism that it'll move up to 23rd, but that's significantly different than when it was in the top 5 when we first started doing that. So conditions, socioeconomic conditions have changed tremendously, and CEOs have noticed that, business leaders have noticed that, and they've really, to some extent, saying that they've given up on expecting Brazil to be part of the next big thing. So and if you look at all 3 of these countries, the BRIC countries, we were given that acronym somewhere in this century. We all acquired the BRIC terminology. I'm here to tell you that largely the BRIC terminology can be retired, at least when it comes to advanced manufacturing. India has fallen from 2nd to 4th to 11th, Brazil from 5th to 8th to 29th, and Russia, never having done very well in this study to begin with, has moved from 20th to 28th to 32nd. So the only portion of BRIC that remains is China. So as we go forward, we see that BRIC has kind of given away to one of those countries, has emerged as the leader. And what's also happened is China is not really that low-cost leader anymore. So countries are trying to find, or companies are trying to find that next low-cost location. It could be India, it could be Vietnam, it could be Malaysia. When we look at their ranking projected for the future, they all go up according to CEOs. But if we look at their ranking relative to where they were in 2013, they've all dropped except for Vietnam. So even low-cost nations are not necessarily rising very rapidly, and we believe that the reason for that is because of the emphasis on advanced manufacturing, that it's no longer about low-cost labor or low-cost factors of production. It's about being able to have the highest talent, being able to bring the best, most advanced capabilities together to drive innovation, which is why we think it syncs up with everything else we've been talking about today. If you look at it from a regional perspective, there are 2 regions of the world that truly stand out in terms of being robust from a competitiveness standpoint. One is North America, where the United States, Canada, and Mexico are all in the top 10 most competitive manufacturing nations, according to CEOs, both now and 5 years from now. And the other is the continued emphasis on Asia Pacific, maybe a less cohesive region, but nonetheless a manufacturing powerhouse and increasingly an advanced manufacturing powerhouse. The news isn't quite so good for Europe. It wasn't good in the past. It hasn't gotten any better for Europe. The combination of with a couple of exceptions in Europe, which are truly notable, which is Germany, continues to be highly regarded. Right? They're ranked currently number 3. They're projected to go to number 3 in the future. That remains the same. They've stayed now in the top rankings, moving from 2013 or 2010 to 2013, they've continued to move up. The other one that's made a tremendous movement forward relative to the past is the United Kingdom. They used to be a really powerful manufacturing nation. They also thought they lost their grip on manufacturing, and at the same time, the other nations of the world realized that manufacturing was a path to prosperity, to good jobs. The UK also got it, and they've now jumped into the top 10. They're really well positioned currently, and as we go forward, there's some concern about whether they can retain their competitiveness, but this has probably been one of the most, just like Brazil has been one of the most startling and declines over the study period of time. The UK has been one of the most startling improvements over the same period of time. So what we're saying is this looks like it's back to the future. If I told you that the most competitive manufacturing nations were the US, Japan, and Germany, you would think that this was 1980. And in fact, that the world order, we've told you for much of the last decade, had changed and that it was shifting to emerging markets and developing nations. But it really is back to the future. The developed markets that were powerful in manufacturing have recaptured the throne of leading manufacturers. And again, only China has stayed within that group. So if you look at both the present and the future, it's the US, it's Germany, it's Japan, it's the UK, and it's China. And so much of that rings back to the 20th century versus the 21st century. And again, we believe that's all because it's about advanced manufacturing. It's certainly not about low-cost manufacturing, because those are not the locations you go to for low-cost manufacturing any longer. And even China is not a place that you go. Okay. The next most important thing is what drives manufacturing competitiveness for nations. And at the very top of the list, I always sweat this out 2 times in a row, Deborah. You don't know what they're going to say. If they don't say the same thing, why didn't they say it? But they told us again that talent is the most important driver, bar none, for manufacturing competitiveness. They go to countries for their talent. They seek out the most talented people. They need the most talented people to drive their innovation agendas. We separated. In the past, we called this talent-driven innovation, but we separated the innovation components, particularly the policy components and the infrastructure components, from talent as a standalone, because we wanted to see if it was really just talent or if it was the investments being made in the infrastructure and the policy. And CEOs, not being particularly fond of government policymakers usually, told us that it's actually not very important. It's slipped down to number 8 when we look at innovation policy, when we look at innovation infrastructure. What they're saying is give us the people, give us the most talented people, train them, educate them, make sure there's a steady supply of them. We'll take care of the rest of the investment in innovation. Thank you very much. And the statistics around R&D show that they are, in fact, carrying the load for research and development. We also see cost competitiveness is extremely important. I don't think in manufacturing it'll ever go away. I don't think you'll ever have a race to be the most expensive manufacturer. And CEOs are telling us, yes, cost competitiveness continues to remain important. Workforce productivity is the 3rd most important driver. 4th is the supplier network. So again, strong ecosystems, not only for innovation. By the way, suppliers of innovation are important. That's part of the ecosystem, but suppliers in general. And then legal and regulatory system round out the top 5. So again, this is nobody else in the world has seen this data except for me and my team. And we've had a press release that went out today with Deborah leading the charge. But it does help kind of focus on some of the critical issues going forward, which is if talent's the differentiator, where are we going to find that talent? And while it's a top driver, it's also a top concern of executives around the world, and particularly in the US. One quote that we had from one of the executives that we were talking to in the Advanced Technology Initiative said the aging of engineering and manufacturing workforces without appropriate knowledge transfer is exacerbating a skills shortage, not only in the US, but also in other developed and developing nations. Talent is at the top of the list for any CEO, any business leader, any C-suite executive that we've talked to. It's everywhere from the shop floor to the skilled workers to the research to the engineering folks. They can't find enough, and they're actually very worried about it. So while the U.S. retains a leadership position in terms of research, technology, and innovation, they do have a demographic edge, there is tremendous concern around talent going forward. So if I want to highlight some of the challenges, a couple more pages, the challenges faced that the executives told us and the additional research corroborated was that there's a significant talent shortage and a widening skills gap. They're concerned about it here in the US, but if we actually look at the same statistics for other countries are actually in worse shape. China is in fact is in one of the most difficult positions because of the demographics. The Chinese population is aging at an incredibly rapid rate, and what's hard to imagine is that by 2050, China will be, on average, significantly older than the US. And if you take the North American region as a whole, Canada, the US, and Mexico, it's a very powerful and demographic positive situation that bodes well for our future competitiveness. There's an uneven and weak foreign market conditions and business environments around the world that are challenging US companies. They're coping with weak intellectual property laws and behavior globally. And there's a very, I'm sure they'd be happy to talk about this for quite a while, there's the high cost and complexity of compliance in an uncertain US regulatory environment, one of their favorite topics. Mario, I know you could probably go on about that a little longer for us. Long term, there are tremendous opportunities. Long-term global trends that provide opportunities for the U.S. There's an expanding middle class and rapid urbanization across Asia. There's continued and plentiful low energy here in the United States and in North America. There's attractive demographics, as I've already mentioned, across North America. There's increased global demand for high-value products like commercial aircraft. There's rapid technological advances that play into the hands or the strength of many companies, particularly in the automotive industry, like autonomous vehicles. And there's increased output in the U.S. chemicals and industrial machinery sectors. And finally, I'll let you look at this in the report because my red clock says it's 00, which means I'm supposed to finish. There's a playbook back there that we were able to assemble as a result of talking to the national laboratory leaders and talking to the private sector, the CTOs, and it's an industry innovation playbook. And in the report, what we've attempted to do is guide the private sector more closely into how they can engage the robust national laboratory capability set and innovation ecosystem, because many of them don't know or haven't used or haven't interacted with the laboratories. So part of the playbook is there to show them lab by lab where they would go, who they would work with, and how they would begin those conversations. And then this particular playbook tells them, how do you approach best practices from an innovation standpoint? Think like a venture capitalist, take a portfolio approach, adopt a risk-tolerant mentality, operate outside of the traditional walls, understand there's no singular solution, have a strategic focus, be explicit around innovation ambitions and goals. Perseverance pays, which means you're going to fail, but you've got to keep at it. Look beyond product innovation to business system innovation and process innovation, and diagnose and be realistic about your capabilities and do something to address them, either through partnerships or through internal acquisition or resource acquisition to bolster your capabilities. That was a very rapid walk through that playbook. The whole report's available to you. Again, I want to thank Deborah for the opportunity to work with the council and the leadership she's provided. Thank you very much.